man's ability to see is in dramatic decline. And we don't mean that in a sort of ophthalmological sense. Like, sure, probably more people have good vision than ever before. But in terms of having a sort of metaphysical depth perception, it's woefully lacking. And I think that the artist's responsibility, and this is what, Pieper says, I'm just riffing off of him, is, to see, again, artists are maybe bad at a lot of things, but what we try to do is to see not what everybody else sees, but to see what everybody else doesn't see. And to kind of suck the sap out of those things and those realities and kind of dramatize them and irradiate the elements of them that are hidden.
Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin, joined today by a very special guest, Joshua Hren, who is the author of a new novel that I'm going to be discussing with him today. The novel is called Blue Walls Falling Down. We're talking in October of 2024, and the book is due out right about now. I was really blessed to get an advance copy and have a chance to read it. Joshua Hren is a man of many talents and involved in many things. He is the editor and founder of Wise Blood Books. He is the co-founder of the Honors College at Belmont Abbey, co-founder of the MFA at the University of St. Thomas. He is the author of numerous essays, poems, nonfiction books, and also now two novels, the first being Infinite Regress, which was published in 2022, and now the newest one, Blue Walls Falling Down. Joshua, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me on. This is a total joy to be here with you.
It is a joy. One of the great things that we talk about, Bobby and I, when we do these podcasts, is we just love to have a chance to talk to our friends and to, have in-depth conversations that we too rarely get to have just kind of over the phone or in person. So great excuse to kind of hit the record button and do it like this.
Agreed. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was just telling you before we started recording that I just finished reading your new novel, Blue Walls Falling Down, and I think it's a very important book. I like it very much, and I hope that the audience will be large for this book, because we need good works of fiction like what you have produced for us. The thing, maybe this is a good place to start. The thing that struck me as I got into the book was how rooted it was in the kind of this, what I still believe is kind of a transition phase in our nation and in the world that we've lived through over the last few years, that sort of began with the pandemic, and then, various kind of social unrest and things that we lived through and are still, I think, not in a great position to understand. So your book puts us right in that world. And before we get into some of the characters, and I want to talk about them in depth, could you just tell us kind of where the idea for the book came from, and kind of the setting, the time in which we're living, and how the book is kind of speaking into that?
Yeah, so I hope you don't mind me answering that question just by saying a little bit about the nature of the novel as the form. And the reason that I love the novel as a form is because, as the name suggests, it deals with the new. That is to say, what is now. Now, as St. John Henry Newman says in his essay on development of doctrine, if you are sort of dealing with new things or kind of alterations, you ought to be very careful. He has this recommendation in terms of avoiding corruption to exercise what he calls a conservative action on the past. And so I think that this is a tremendously important kind of caution, and also a really rich piece of advice for everyone, but especially those who are committed to conserving culture. And so, but then you go from there, you say, well, why do we need to write new novels at all? Why do we need new art when we have such a rich patrimony already? We already have Dostoevsky, we already have Flannery O'Connor. The Greeks could live off of Homer for 750 years. So why deal with something that's set in the present moment? And I think that another difficulty that comes up when you're facing that kind of question is, how do you address what is passing, what is very contemporary, without it the art devolving into kind of either journalism or sociological study. And it's not to say anything against journalism. Like Flannery O'Connor, I have my reservations about sociology, but 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 it is to say that you have to kind of figure out ways to grasp what is permanent from what is passing. And the same St. John Henry Newman who gave us that advice to exercise conservative action on the past says in Development of Doctrine that enduring truths must sometimes change in order to remain the same. In a higher world, it is otherwise, but here below, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. And so I think that this leads us into a suggestion that another thinker who's been very important to me, Philip Rieff, who wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, says that every generation therefore needs these spies of the sacred order dedicated to the proposition that the eternal truths have been revealed once and for all, but they require constant rereading and reapplication and reinterpretation in light of the particulars of the moment. And there's a funny line in an essay by David Foster Wallace called E Unibus Plurum, where he talks about this writing teacher who says, you want to write enduring art, so you got to sort of scrub from your novel any allusions to popular culture, any dates that would show that this is capable of wear. And Wallace's response to that is, okay, that sounds nice, but where do we stop? How do you avoid mentioning something that people will understand in 2020 that they won't understand in 2120, right? And so that all of those kinds of concerns were very much present to me while I was working on this novel, because the Infinite Regress was also dealing with urgent contemporary concerns, you could say. And it was similar, but this one even more so, in part because it reckons with kind of the ideological polarization of our moment. And I would say that it's an anti-ideological novel, is the way that I would state it negatively. Hopefully, eventually we can come around to a more positive way of appraising it. But what I notice, I mean, this isn't saying that much. It's not anything profound, but I remember in 2020, especially, getting the morning news from the New York Times and then from the Epic Times, and it was literally like I mean, it was schizophrenic. It was as if it wasn't as if we just have one shared reality and we're just arriving at different conclusions from that shared reality. It was as if we're living in two separate fantasy worlds, depending on sort of your political, ideological commitments or persuasions. And so I think that in terms of the novel's concern with the political, that's what the origin was, just feeling that kind of tension. And I'm sure that you experienced this as well. I mean, my entire Catholic life, I returned to the church after leaving it at age 13, roughly, and came back at age 21, and came back largely through reading the life of St. Francis, having a somewhat seemingly mystical experience with the Eucharist, and then reading Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness. And what I fast realized is that, I had Catholic friends who were, praying the rosary. I shouldn't say Catholic friends. They were real Catholics. That's not the right scare quotes. But I had, Catholic friends I was meeting with praying the rosary at 6 a.m. And then I had these other friends who were kind of not really committed to the metaphysical truths of the church, but they were engaged in social activism and protesting the war in Iraq at the time. And then also just working with the Catholic Worker in Milwaukee. And ever since then, it's been just almost always more of the same, where if you're in a kind of American progressive crowd, you're going to feel like the outsider as a Catholic. And if you're in what typically passes for American conservatism in this country, you're going to feel like another kind of wayfarer, wanderer, outsider, loner. And so the novel, I think, is really born out of that tension, that frustration. And it comes from the heart of the novel is very much rooted, hopefully, in a vision of the political that is that it's participating in the long Catholic understanding of what that is, even though it's dealing with very contemporary injustices. The last thing that I would just say is specifically with regard to some of the inspirations or the particular things that kind of commenced the novel. It's actually, I will be totally frank and say that I can't mention all of it because some of the characters are tied up with living people who I would rather not, for ethical reasons, sort of out. And even some of my own past experience, I promise you that I wasn't involved in terroristic activity. But, when I was probably 17 or 18, I remember, I lived a very bohemian life, waited tables and wrote, worked on art. I didn't think I was college material. And my friends and I would hang out at these 24-hour diners in Milwaukee in a kind of, sort of more active cultural neighborhood where there was a lot of conversations about art and politics. And I vividly remember it was certainly not between the hours of 6 a.m. and midnight. It was probably 1 or 2 a.m. We were sitting in one of these diners smoking cigarettes and listening to these revolutionaries in the booth across, and they were quite literally plotting an uprising where they were going to sort of activate the proletariat. And I, from that point forward, encountered a number of different radical people who were involved in radical politics, and they most certainly contribute to sort of some of what the novel is, again, grappling with. In terms of the way that this novel, Henry James has this, American novelist Henry James has this term that he uses called the doni, and it's this idea that the inspiration, the character kind of visits you without you really going to look for them. And so what I can say is that I didn't know why she showed up, but Stella, the protagonist of the novel, Stella Tesknota, and the name suggests, the last name has its roots in a kind of nostalgia, is the Polish. She kind of showed up and she was just sitting there in a dimly lit blue room holding a baby. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the way that I work writing fiction, that's always how it begins. It's just, there's a vivid image. I have no idea why it arrives. I don't know who this person is, but then I just dwelt with her, tried to stay in that room with her over the course of weeks and months, and then started to piece together why she was there with that baby, which really is where the novel comes from.
Mm. That such wonderful stuff in that answer, and I have to say, reading this novel, it's very clear that the man who wrote it, I don't know, has seen some things. There's just so your own sort of testimony there about your young bohemian life and all is very telling. I think a lot of that will come through in the way that you depict Stella's world, where she is working as a teacher in this really rough area of Chicago, and then as the novel moves back to her hometown of Milwaukee, in some respects the worlds feel very similar in terms of just their, it doesn't feel, for example, like suburban Texas where I live. I mean, it feels sort of gritty, urban, upper Midwest throughout. And yet, as you said before, it's really the two worlds that you were processing, these sort of two fantasy political worlds, are represented in a sense by the world that Stella lives in Chicago, and then what she encounters when she goes home to her family in Milwaukee. And so maybe we could dwell on Stella for a minute and sort of how so she was a character in your previous novel, I know, or sorry, maybe she wasn't, but she's
Well,
related to a character in your
she
previous.
is, yeah. So she
More about her.
basically engaged to Blake Yorick, who is the protagonist of Infinite Regress. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that's for me anyway. I need to go back and read your previous novel. I've jumped right in medias res, as it were, with Stella's life, but I found myself very, immediately drawn into her situation. And I have to admit, I did type in her last name just in case it meant something. And indeed, as you've already explained to us, it's Polish for longing or yearning or nostalgia or something, which really seems to sum up a lot about her. She's just a fascinating character. I don't know, you mentioned before, that she just sort of came to you, but she reminds me of women that I know or have known or that I observe who are, they get to a certain place in their life. Stella is, I guess, in just turning 40, I guess, as the novel begins, and she's had an engagement broken off and is wondering, what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? Like, what am I as a woman? I'm not married. I don't have a child yet, all this sort of stuff. And then she meets, I guess I'm ramping up to ask you about the man that she meets. This man, Peter Claver or Peter Clavier, or however we say it, but named after a saint, and then her life suddenly opens up in a very interesting kind of way. I wonder if you could sort of tell us where that character comes from.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for picking up on, first of all, so Peter's name, Peter Clavier, is intentionally kind of proximate to Peter Claver the Saint, but intentionally also not Peter Claver the Saint, because there is this kind of discrepancy between, his commitments and the promise that he once possessed in terms of becoming something like a prophet or a saint. And I guess I will just, if it's okay, just begin with that really briefly, that, Peter PC, and obviously I'll let the audience do with that what they will.
Yeah.
But his uncle, whose nickname is Minor C, was hugely influential in raising him. His uncle was a jazz musician and also a pastor, and he was able to kind of transcend the dividing line that separates typically those two worlds, the secular and the sacred, so to speak. But he had prophesied a kind of otherworldly future for Peter Clavier, where he would serve some sort of world historical purpose on behalf of the people of God. And Peter Clavier's life is marked with this kind of extraordinary level of recognition and consequentiality. So he's hugely consequential in the world of radical politics, to the point that he's summoned to go to Washington, D.C. to lead an arm of the movement, but he has distanced himself for much of the novel, certainly when we find him in the beginning, from his religious faith of his youth, and therefore of the prophecy of his uncle. But that being said, he's also distanced himself from some of his earlier political ideological commitments. And this is hugely important for understanding him. So when we meet him, Stella remembers having heard him on National Public Radio. That was her first kind of encounter. And so part of what's happening is what Walker Percy describes as, in the moviegoer, as he calls it certification. It's the idea that, you can be walking down the street, everything seems sort of humdrum and ordinary, and then all of a sudden you see a celebrity or a movie star. And then, they touch your life with their golden finger. And so, everything it has an aura around it. And so, Stella has some of that with regards to Peter, because she remembers vividly the interview. But in the interview, the National Public Radio host expects him to be sort of on board with her own political presumptions, and he's throwing basically Molotov cocktails left and right, because he earlier was committed to a kind of project of, radical decolonialization that was rooted in the work of a very important French Algerian political philosopher and activist named psychologist named Frantz Fanon. And it's no accident that Frantz Fanon was both a political activist and a psychologist, because Peter Clavier is also a political activist and psychologist. Now, what he says that he found is that, he was gaining a lot of fame writing influential essays and, stirring things up rhetorically for the movement, but he was dissatisfied with there being any sort of follow-up action. It's kind of like in Dostoevsky's novels, Demons, where there are his political novel, his great political novel, where there's this kind of room of revolutionaries, and after they have a meeting about whether they should have a meeting, and they decide what a meeting is, and they decide what the word yes means, and that, it's this hilarious moment. But then one of the characters sort of gives this grand sweeping vision of political equality that begins with Plato and ends with Fourier, the French socialist. And and in order to do that, you have to chop off 100 million heads. But there's the sense that they don't even know what they're talking about in any kind of gritty, real way. And then Peter Verkovensky, one of the main revolutionaries in that novel, says, enough with all of this. This is all just aesthetics, right? Let's actually do something. So for Peter Clavier, he passes through a similar kind of, I guess you could call it a conversion in a non-religious sense. But what he turns to is he turns away from these kinds of political movements, which, by the way, I should say, he gets involved in, and I won't mention the proxy group that we're all familiar with, that it's similar to. I just won't even mention the name because people can make of it what they will. I don't like to over-explain too much. But I can say that he got into that movement not because he wanted to partake of sort of some of the things of defunding the police and whatnot, but rather because he says he was tired of growing up with having to go to another funeral every single week. Why is I'm going to my cousin's funeral this week, I'm going to my aunt's funeral the next week, and in this one zip code there were just this tremendous amount of death. And I remember from my days in working more among the Catholic worker crowd, that there was someone who mentioned to me that you can just sort of trace a lot of people's fates by their zip code, and I never forgot it. And I don't believe in a kind of Marxist determinism at all. I don't think that that's absolutely true, but it's not also entirely untrue. I think that I'm a very in the deepest sense conservative person, but one of the things that frustrates me sometimes with conservatism is that it gets too caught up with ideas, and it ignores material causality. So of course, the final cause of what teleologically we were made for, which is the beatific vision and union with God, is the most important cause. But material conditions matter. And if you're growing up in a kind of, nightmare of violence, then that's going to alter every decision that you make. And it's going to be really hard to be good, So that's more of the disposition, I guess you could say, that Peter has. And Stella meets him when she's working at this school, and she has sort of thrown herself into this really difficult teaching assignment at Cabrini's school. So, the novel really plays with the kind of Catholic heritage of this country that is oftentimes somewhat muted, or aspects of it that are a little bit less familiar. So, for example, the tradition of Catholicism within the Black community that comes from New Orleans, and how that sort of migrated to Chicago. And then also, even the projects in Chicago, one of the most famous vertical ghettos in history, which is Cabrini Green, which was, basically eventually overtaken by gangs, and then finally was just demolished. And that's where Peter Clavier grew up. He grew up there. And I just remember being a child. When I was a child, I would just watch the way in which, in the neighborhood that I was growing up with, in my maybe mid-teens, almost everyone who was getting pulled over was Black, right? And I remember when I was in 8th grade, there were 2 Black students, and one of them, her father had died of cancer the semester before she graduated 8th grade, and because her family couldn't afford the tuition, the pastor of the school, the Catholic school, which had just bought a $40,000 sign that just said the parish's name in the front lawn, would not let her finish that last semester. And so my moral imagination, it was formed by, in part, kind of racial injustice. And I just want to say a little word about that because I think that can be really misunderstood. On the one hand, you have kind of what we now call woke, which I think is very much of a different kind of awful thing. But then there's just sort of the old school Catholic concern with prejudice. I mean, that's been around since St. Paul, trying to transcend the Jews and the Greeks. And so I think that again, these are all things that both Peter and Stella are all concerned with. But so Stella, when she comes down there, she's partially throwing herself into it in a state of despair, out of her broken relationship with Blake York, who disappeared without giving her any reason. Now, I will say that the reason will be revealed in the third novel of the trilogy, which is the Hotel Dieu. And it is very much like Infinite Regress is the Inferno. Blue Walls Falling Down, as the title suggests, this sort of this falling down of sadness, is a purgatorial novel, and then Hotel Dieu will be the paradisial one. But so she basically just she throws herself partially in a state of despair that ultimately leads to a kind of purgation, unexpectedly, because she fails so roundly. So, and I guess that's, I would say, I mean, you were very generous in your introductory bio of me, but what you left out is that I've had a lot of accomplishments. I also have a lot of failures, and I'm not going to mention them all because I talked to my confessor about them. But I think that the novel oftentimes novel as a form, or novels in general, really come out, and Faulkner was really good on this, of this sense of you're aspiring after some sort of genuine good, but then you don't actually reach that. It might be a genuine good, but it might not be the right good for you. Mm-hmm. So Stella wants to help these kids in this rough school named after St. Cabrini, St. Francis Cabrini, but she doesn't belong in that school at all. I mean, she's doing more harm than good. And so she kind of throws herself into Peter Clavier's arms, quite literally, in part because she is in over her head. And she doesn't quite realize it. She convinces herself that she's going to talk with him out of sympathy for him, right? But that's kind of what the novel does as a genre. It always says, like Milan Kundera says, but the novel is the spirit of the novel is the spirit of complexity. Yeah. It always says to us, things are not as simple as they seem. Things are not what we usually tell ourselves they are, right? And our motives are usually multifaceted. We have good motives and we have untoward motives. And as this is just St. Thomas Aquinas too, right? Like every time we do something evil, we do it under the aspect of the good. We convince ourselves that we're doing something good, right? So anyway, all of that went into it. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And, reading the novel really, it was convicting to me in a way, because the things that you write about are things that are so easily, you mentioned before, we'll come back to this, but you mentioned before whether you read your news in the New York Times or the Epoch Times or whatever. I mean, the issues that you are exploring in these characters are just so easily caricatured or misrepresented or whatever. And I think your novel convicted me when I watch certain great films. This happens to me too. I think I kind of feel like an idiot, because I think, why am I even thinking about these matters kind of outside a richer context of a story that can be kind of laid out the way that a novelist or a filmmaker can. So I think when people read your book, they will find nuance and complexity in these questions that need it. And so I'm grateful for that. On that note, though, I want to ask you a little more about Stella. Yeah. So it seems to me, she does go down to Chicago, to take up this teaching assignment. But in some ways it seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me that in some ways she is kind of naturally not very ideological, even though she does kind of like want to be in certain ways, right? But it seems to me that the characters in her life, these two men in her life, predominantly Peter, but then also her father, they both, in a sense, tone down their ideology for her. I mean, well, I guess, I don't know, Peter kind of plays it up, but then tones it down, and so it's like they both know that they love her and that she's not just somebody that they can sort of use as somebody to carry forward their ideas or something
Mhm,
like that,
mhm.
and that's something I admired about her character, that and it's that longing thing. It's like she somehow gets it deep down that she's made for something more than just today's concerns about this or that. And that's what she's trying to figure out.
Totally, yeah. So a couple things on that. I mean, I would just say, again, I mentioned earlier those radicals that I met in that all-night diner, and I would just say too that Dostoevsky was very much sort of he himself, Dostoevsky, was involved in more liberal politics, which under Tsarist Russia were considered radical. It was sort of like a glorified book club in some ways that he was involved in Petrushevsky's circle, and then he was put into prison and almost shot before a death squad and ultimately sent off to Siberia for his involvement in that sort of thing. But I think that what I really admire about his novels is that, in Devils especially, it's sometimes translated The Possessed. He does not caricature the radicals. They are, so I'll give you an example. In the novel The Idiot, the character Hippolyte is this kind of nihilist. Dostoevsky's really much into like sort of different kinds of nihilism. And this character Hippolyte he's dying of consumption. And so he's decrying the way in which, he's been dealt a fate that he didn't ask for. He didn't ask to be born, and God just sort of threw him into the world without his permission. And now he's going to die young. And he comes up with his entire sort of nihilistic system kind of that seems to really be growing out of his own resentment toward reality, right? But then when Dostoevsky's writing The Devils, you have these characters who are just remarkably selfless. And I remember thinking about this when I read Veritatis Splendor of John Paul II, where he talks about, there's in a sense, there's nothing more convincing about the truth. There's no better way to convince people or testify to the truths of Christianity than martyrdom. And I certainly understand that, and I agree with that. But there are also martyrs of communism, and there are also martyrs of all sorts of other different causes who give their lives for those causes. And obviously, there's something simultaneously really terrifying and scary about that because of what people are willing to die for, being so innately evil. But there's also a shift from the young man who's condemned to die in Dostoevsky's characters too. These people who they could be doing other things with their lives, and they are sacrificing themselves for what they at least perceive to be a political good. So I just want to clarify that with regards to Peter Clavier. I mean, I see him as also transcending his own earlier ideologies as the novel moves on. But with Stella, I think that she very much is kind of not willing to, at least in their first interactions, kind of put up with his somewhat histrionic, or what is the exhibitionistic kind of.
Yeah, he really holds court in a way, or tries to. Yeah.
Yeah, very much. And like, the irony about that is, of course, he goes on and on and on about how he's involved in all these things that are sort of outside of himself, but in fact, he talks about himself quite a lot. And I think that she simultaneously is really attracted to him because she sees him as so given over to something. And she is, like many people in our time, in especially the younger generations, just sort of like, what are we even living for anymore? America is famous for its optimism. I was reading something that Ralph Ellison, who the novel really owes a lot to, wrote about sort of the indomitable optimistic spirit of America, and I don't think that it is indomitable anymore. I think what we're seeing is actually people who are just sort of giving up, and you see this in polls about what young people, their commitments to sort of patriotism now is I'm going to botch the statistics, so you can fact check this, and it's going to be not accurate, but it's like 20% now of young people are feeling patriotic or have some sort of semblance of patriotism, versus even in the 90s, it was like 90%, something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, Stella is sort of like that, where she's taken refuge in a very kind of quiet life, but not necessarily for the right reasons, not in a kind of spirit of humility, but out of a kind of lostness.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but one of the guiding quotes of the novel that's in the background or hovering over it is Dorothy Day's line about everybody wants to start a revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a scene where Stella is again, admiring Peter Clavier when he's running for alderman and he's organized this entire city block. He's rallied them all to put up a traffic circle in the middle of a street where the accidents just keep happening because people are driving like 70 miles an hour on a 20-mile-an-hour road, and the police force is doing nothing about it because defund the police. And so he rallies everybody to sort of just take the refuse of all of the wreckage that's happened and to build this traffic circle out of it. And he stands on top of the traffic circle and begins to deliver a sort of a speech. And Stella is simultaneously kind of smitten with what he's saying, but then she's also just kind of terrified because she's afraid he's going to get killed. And she begs him to come down, and she goes back home, and the scene just switches to her just going home and doing the dishes, right? That no one else is going to do. And so I want to build on that just by saying that not only is she going to do the dishes, but she's also going to have a baby. And I don't mind ruining the plot giving away a little bit. Saying that, I mean, so I think that there's something about her femininity is a big concern for her, and she has been told. I think of the work of Mary Harrington or someone like this, right? Who's Feminism Against Progress. Like, I mean, there's a lot of insight in that kind of idea that she says that like there are a lot of women who go through this experience of like sort of wanting to be a careerist, but then they find themselves in the career and they say, well, actually, now that I'm here, I'd rather have a baby. I know that that's not everybody, but it's a common enough phenomenon. Or you have a career and you then have a baby and then you're sort of like, well, I would rather stay at home, but I can't anymore, right? Because of the student debt or whatever it might be. And so Stella, I think her rootedness and her being protected, you could say, that's not the right word, but being sort of immune to some of these ideological convolutions comes out of her rootedness in the real, in the fact that her body is reminding her that she has a baby for much of the novel, and that she can't sort of become this Cartesian mind kind of wandering around, like Tocqueville says, like in America, nobody's read Descartes, but everybody acts like they're these Cartesian, machines without a soul. And yet maybe one protection against that is sort of the best elements of femininity, right? And so I think that the novel's exploring that. Yeah.
I don't know if you know this song, but as I was reading especially the beginning part of the novel, I was thinking of the Portishead song "Glory Box," where Beth Gibbons sings "Give me a reason to be a woman." She's sort of like there's so much longing in her voice in that song as well, and I just was imagining that as part of the soundtrack to.
That's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I don't know the song, but I'm going to check it out.
Yeah, it's a good one. Let's talk about your style a little bit. And I'd love to kind of spend a little time before we're finished talking about what you call contemplative realism. But before we get to that, just you've mentioned a lot of authors in what you've said in your answers so far. You've mentioned Dostoevsky, you've mentioned David Foster Wallace. Who else? Flannery O'Connor, and I think those are all people that we might compare you to in certain respects, for sure. Another author that I was thinking of, especially at the end of the novel, I don't know if this surprises you or not, but I was thinking of Tom Wolfe really strongly, because especially I won't give anything away, but the last probably 40 or 50 pages of the novel are really, at least my interpretation of them, they were very frenetic. I mean, it was, wow, it just a lot happens and it's chaotic and it's traumatic and wild. And that, in my experience, is the way Tom Wolfe ends his novels as well. So I don't know. I wonder if you could you don't have to say anything about Tom Wolfe if you don't want to, but just kind of the style, like how you decide to tell the story, like, how do you do that?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I it's a great question, and in some sense, I can't really even answer it probably accurately, but I'm going to pretend that I can, because I ultimately don't. I mean, so let me just put it like this: I don't believe in the romantic myth that the author is this sort of genius who is struck by the lightning of inspiration and that there's no rational craft. I believe that art is a habit of the rational intellect, as Maritain put it very firmly. I see that because, I used to have to write every day or else I'd fall out of the habit, but then I developed the habitus of art. And so even if I only write once a week, it just sort of automatically comes. So I believe that the habit is really real. But I would say that the style kind of it owes a lot to the great realists of the European novelistic tradition. So everyone from Balzac to well, let's just say Balzac to all the way to Willa Cather. And I think that, Willa Cather says that realism is a protest against lies.
Hmm.
So I think one of the things that I really love about realism is as St. John Henry Newman says it actually in his discourse on literature from Idea of the University. He says that literature teaches us to take things as they are, not as we would want them to be, right? So on the one hand, you have that, but that can oftentimes devolve into a kind of celebration of the underbelly of reality, almost this sense that like the darkest things are what is most real. Um, the most disturbing things, the things that we don't want to talk about are reality. And we kind of use this in our common parlance as well. Like, come on, get real. And usually that can mean something like, stop talking about beautiful things or something, right? So
Right.
that's where the sort of the weakness of just sort of raw realism can emerge. And so the contemplative part of it is growing out of kind of Josef Pieper's sense that we are living in a time where man's ability to see is in decline. Man's ability to see is in dramatic decline. And we don't mean that in a sort of ophthalmological sense. Like, sure, probably more people have good vision than ever before. But in terms of having a sort of metaphysical depth perception, it's woefully lacking. And I think that the artist's responsibility, and this is what, Pieper says, I'm just riffing off of him, is, to see, again, artists are maybe bad at a lot of things, but what we try to do is to see not what everybody else sees, but to see what everybody else doesn't see. And to kind of suck the sap out of those things and those realities and kind of dramatize them and irradiate the elements of them that are hidden. Now, that also sometimes can take the form of scenes that feel or can be larger than life. So in Infinite Regress, since that one's been out for a while, I won't ruin it by saying that there's a moment when, Blake York is working at a teleprompter sort of student loan call center. And, he has his job is basically to go on this script where he calls people and tells them that they need to give their money, pay up their student loans, or else the parts of their brain that were enriched by their education will be forcibly removed by the loan, right? And and then right after that moment, he his self when he leaves, he goes back home, and a little while later, he gets a phone call, and it's himself, right? So
Mm.
it's
Hmm.
himself calling himself, and readers were very confused because it was like, well, wait a minute, this is not realistic. Like, this isn't what really happens. But that I really owe all of those kinds of things to Dostoevsky, and he called his realism a kind of fantastical realism, and it was a higher realism than anyone else. He says realists can never fear the results of their study, right? Sometimes their study actually reveals that the things that we normally speak about as kind of how things are actually a ruse. And so in Dostoevsky's novels, and you kind of got at that, in your remarks about the end of the novel, they can become carnivalesque. So
Hmm.
basically, what he does a lot, and I do this too, is you just bring for his dialogic imagination allows him to kind of bring people together into the same space who would normally never be in one another's presence. So like he oftentimes has these really dramatic outbursts happening at like a drawing room party, a salon that's supposed to be really in polite society, and it just spills over into chaos because people start externalizing their deepest interior thoughts and convictions. So I think that that's kind of what the novel is doing, and sometimes that can take the form of a kind of intense lyrical psychological dreamscape is the way that I would put it. Like there's an intensity to it There's a lyrical aspect to it that swells over, that's like a cascade. But hopefully those cascades, the goal, which I'm sure is not successful at every turn, but the goal is to have those swells be proportionate to the moment that's being kind of depicted, and in other moments to have there being more like subdued, right? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Just really one other thing. I mean, you know film so much better than I do, but I think of it in terms of like Terrence Malick, where someone said, I think it was the novelist Christopher Beha said, he called it the Terrence Malick effect. Like sometimes it feels as if he's trying to make everything transcendent.
mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And then what happens is you forget that some things aren't, and you would lose your ability to be content with the mundane. And so sometimes some of what the novel is trying to describe is just the mundane, cyclical parts of our lives, where you're just watching the seasons change and you don't even realize that the days are passing. And then sometimes you have sort of a preacher sort of, trying to deal with the aftermath of a botched kind of funeral procession. And there are people kind of climbing down the fire escape ladders, in the midst of a kind of moment of political chaos. So both of those are parts of our world, and there's a beauty in the brokenness in there, right? That's what I always try to capture, is that there's beauty in the brokenness. There's also some things that are beautiful that aren't broken, and there are also things that are broken that are not beautiful. And I guess I would just say, I think that's a really important thing about the novel as a form. And you can say this about movies too, but like when we talk in conservative circles or Catholic circles about beauty, oftentimes talk about art, we oftentimes talk about beauty, beauty, beauty. And I think that's true, right? But the novel is also committed to truth. And sometimes truth is not pleasant, and sometimes it's not immediately beautiful, right? So I guess all of that is caught up in the style.
Yeah, I would echo what you're saying about cinema as well. I really I love beauty, love it, but I have a real appetite for realism, because I don't know, maybe it's a gift, maybe it's grace, I don't know, but I really want to see the deeper reality that one can engage with in that way, which isn't always beautiful. And that leads me to ask you about this, that I very much hope that novels like yours and there are others working in similar ways, but I do fear that our culture has really lost the appetite for realism, because I actually was just reading for another conversation I'm going to be having, a conversation I'm going to be having with Joseph Pierce, and he wrote something about Oscar Wilde's comments on late Victorian times. Like he said something like, that the people of that time had no appetite for realism because they didn't want to look at what was underneath, but they also had no appetite for romanticism because they had no interest in transcending it. I fear that we're kind of in a similar place in some ways now.
I mean, I think that there are so many obstacles to a novel like this being well received and widely received. And I always am wary of the artist's sort of get out of jail free card, which is like, my greatness will be recognized after I'm dead and gone.
But there's something to that. There is. And, could you live with yourself if you were writing just schlocky, stuff?
No,
right?
I mean, Flannery O'Connor's famous line is like, if you learn how to write badly enough, which is basically writing according to the appetites of the time, you can make a killing, she says, right? So I think that one of the great obstacles is what Becca Rothfield terms this kind of school of literature called sanctimony literature. And it's this kind of tidally bifurcated interest in good people and bad people, right? When in fact what they should be studying is the good and the bad in all people.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing about sanctimony literature is that it really is largely coming out of more progressive artistic movements. So it's kind of, especially sanctimony literature is featuring, typically historically underrepresented characters who kind of don't do anything wrong, right? Well, guess what? I mean, one of my characters happens to be human. He happens to be an inheritor of concupiscence and of the fall. And so there's no way that I could write Peter Clavere's character. I mean, admittedly, he's complicated, not only as in all the ways that we talked about, but he's also albino, right? But he's very flawed. And so he doesn't hold all the right opinions, right? He holds some good opinions and he holds some significant errors. but there is a way in which just even, in the dominant literary culture, even just the idea that you could represent some as a you know a white writer. Well, if somebody asked me that, I would say, well, tell me what you mean by that, right? Like,
Right.
do you mean, are you speaking in particular of kind of my German inheritance or the French part or the Irish part, right? And we could go on because
Right.
those are very distinct cultures,
Yeah.
as Benedict the 16th, knew very well. Um, but I think we've sort of sacrificed that complexity. And what's amazing is that therefore you're going back to almost like a morality play in art. And what the novel emerged out of was a kind of rejection of the oversimplifications of the morality play in favor of a goodly kind of moral complexity. Now, I do think that it can be pushed too far, right? Like Milan Kundera sort of argues that the novel is not just the spirit of complexity, but it's relativistic. Like you have multiple competing voices, and not one or the other of them could ever be elevated above as definitively morally superior, right? So I think that is an error. But I think that I'll say that I think this is a really important thing to get in here, actually, in response to your question. Is I'm trying to find this passage. Okay, the contemporary novelist Jordan Castro says, he wrote it. He this was in a tweet, and it redeemed my sense that like social media is not totally vacuous, because it's a very powerful insight. He says it's very unfashionable in contemporary literature to say that there is even an implicit answer to any existential or philosophical question that gets raised in the text. He goes on, I get it. One shouldn't be didactic in their art, but many authors confuse an active, authentic, constrained open-endedness, which is good, with something much more muddled and meandering. They adopt an anti-didactic, anti-moralist posture as an excuse to absolve themselves of the necessity of having a deep, specific view or vision, right? So, and I think that what I really strive after and what I call for and summon out of my students and out of the whole movement that I'm involved in is this. David Foster Wallace in his essay on Dostoevsky said, what makes Dostoevsky great is that he was not just a genius, he was brave. And so I think that, you can't actually write for the anticipated sanctimony literature audience. You have to throw the gauntlet down. You have to take moral risks. You have to have the courage to be sort of disparaged, because it will be misunderstood. In Conrad's, after Joseph Conrad, who's like this aristocratic conservative, in his novel, The Secret Agent, like people thought that he was an anarchist because he wrote the anarchist characters so compellingly. Do you know what I mean? Like, so there's always the risk of misunderstanding, but we have to write literature that restores a sense of stakes, right? Like there's something serious at stake here. And it might take a while for people to actually respond to that. Maybe no one ever will, but I don't see any other way that I could sleep at night. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know.
Yeah, well, that bravery comes across in the novel for sure. And I hope you take this as a compliment that I'm not sure if someone just picked up your novel and didn't know anything about you, I'm not sure they would know that it was the work of a faithful practicing Catholic. I think they would know that it was somebody who was very concerned with moral questions and who definitely had like an interest in, as you said before, this kind of like Catholic pedigree or like Catholic identity of like kind of the country or something like that to some degree. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you're telling a story, and it's these characters are none of them are going to sort of, when you close the novel, are you going to think, well, that's a real triumph of the gospel there or whatever. I mean, I mean, in a way maybe, but it's right. not so obvious.
So what I would say is this: yes, the moments of the novel, there are moments, and I won't again try to like sort of teach readers how to find them or where to find them, but just to say that I would argue there are moments where the claims of the gospel are definitively sort of dramatized with great conviction, but they don't necessarily alter the outcome of people's lives to become materially better, if that makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, it's sort of like the aesthetics of the cross in that sense, right? Like the truth of the gospel that is proclaimed is said in spite of the fact that death is sort of like around the door, if that makes sense. Or like, do you know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and there are definitely characters whose positions, some of them I really agree with, but even a character like Minor C, who I agree with a lot of what he says, I don't agree with everything that he says. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so I wanted to give him his freedom to sort of disagree with me. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
on certain matters, and without sort of like devolving into kind of relativism, but just out of a kind of good sense of like Christian freedom. Like
Yeah.
God, my goodness, like this is something I was just talking about with my students last night. Like if you think about God as an artist, like he has created an incredibly gorgeous artwork in his creation. He's also allows his characters, so to speak, right, to be exposed to unbelievably horrific scandals, not of their own making. And he gives what that means is that he gives his people, he gives all of us a tremendous degree of freedom, one that is actually sort of overwhelming sometimes, right? And I think that yeah, so that's like of great importance to my way of understanding reality, and therefore my way of understanding art. I mean, it's not a valorization of freedom in the libertarian sense. I hope that
Right.
comes through, or something like that. It's more
Yeah.
just like in a metaphysical sense. We have, like Dmitry Karamazov says, one of the things that his beefs with God is basically, you've made man too broad.
Yeah.
He can make the Madonna, and he can make Sodom and Gomorrah. He said, if I were you, God, I would have narrowed man so that he's not capable of these extremes. Do you know what I mean? But that's not what God did.
Right.
He allowed like this tremendous range of like beauty and brokenness, again, to go back to what we were talking about before.
Yeah. I love that. I love that turn of phrase, aesthetics of the cross. I think that well encapsulates much of what comes across in your book. On that note, we're just about out of time, so I'm holding up the book so our viewing audience can see. Anyway, Blue Walls Falling Down by Joshua Hren. Joshua, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, I'm just overwhelmed with gratitude. Thank you so much for this. I can't thank you enough.
We'll do it again soon. And to our audience, we encourage you to give us a good review, share this episode with friends. We want to get the message out, not only of Joshua's book, but of our project at the Space Salvi Institute. So until next time, God bless and live in hope.